Historians generally cite four long-term causes of the First World War: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and the formation of a system of alliances in Europe. Nationalism is a devotion to the interest and culture of one's own nation. Nationalism often led to the competitive and antagonistic rivalries among nations commonly seen in Europe shortly after the turn of the century. It influenced politics throughout the Western world throughout the 19th century. Imperialism. For many centuries, European nations had been building empires, slowly extending their economic and political control over various people. Colonies supplied the European imperial powers with raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. As Germany industrialized, it competed with France and Britain for colonies. These empires were expensive to build and defend, so the growth of nationalism and imperialism also led to militarism, increased military spending. The imperial powers pushed the development of armed forces and their use as a tool of diplomacy. By 1890, Germany was the strongest nation on the European continent, yet the British Navy was still the strongest navy in the world. By 1897, nearly every imperialist power was involved in a worldwide naval arms race. By 1907, there were also two different major defense alliances in Europe. The Triple Entente, later known as the Allies, consisted of France, Britain, and Russia. The Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Germany and Austria-Hungary would later unite with the Ottoman Empire to form the Central Powers. The alliances provided a measure of international security because nations were reluctant to disturb the balance of power. The spark that ignited the First World War occurred in the Balkans, which was known as the powder keg of Europe. In addition to ethnic rivalries among the Balkan people, Europe's leading powers all had interests there. Russia wanted access to the Mediterranean Sea and claimed to be the protector of all Slavic people in Europe. Germany wanted a rail link to the Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary had taken over control of Bosnia in 1878 and accused Serbia of subverting its rule over Bosnia. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, visited the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. While his entourage drove through the city, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip stepped from the crowd and fired into the Archduke's car, killing Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. These assassinations touched off a diplomatic crisis. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary launched what is expected to be a short war against Serbia, but the alliance system pulled one nation after another into the conflict. On August 1st, obligated by a treaty to support Austria-Hungary, Germany declares war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on Russia's ally, France. Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium, because it offered the quickest route to France, caused Britain to declare war on Germany on August 4th. What became known as the Great War had begun. On August 3, 1914, Germany, in an effort to reach France, whom it had declared war against, invaded Belgium, implementing a strategy known as the von Schlieffen Plan. This plan called for Germany to fight a holding action against Russia in the east, while executing a quick offensive strike through Belgium to take Paris. After France had fallen, Germany expected to then turn her full military might against Russia. As the German army swept through Belgium, thousands of civilians fled in terror. Unable to save Belgium, the Allies retreated to a line along the River Marne in France, where they eventually halted the German advance in September 1914. After repeated unsuccessful attempts to outflank each other, both sides dug in for a long siege. By the spring of 1915, two parallel systems of deep, rat-infested trenches crossed France from the Belgian coast to the Swiss Alps. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a barren expanse of land torn by gunfire where death awaited any man who exposed himself. The scale of the slaughter in this fighting was horrific. During the First Battle of the Somme, from July to November 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day of fighting alone. Final casualties in this campaign totaled about 1.2 million, yet only about 7 miles of ground changed hands. Trench warfare, in which the armies fought for control of mere yards of ground, would continue for 3 years. Since 1898, the United States had acted as a major power by intervening in the Caribbean and asserting an open-door policy in China. Yet America strongly held to the traditions of Washington and Jefferson of not allying the nation with any European power or becoming involved in a war on the other side of the Atlantic. President Wilson's first response to the outbreak of the European War was predictable. He issued a declaration of U.S. neutrality and called upon the American people to support his policy by not taking sides. Wilson soon found it was difficult, if not impossible, to protect U.S. trading rights and maintain a policy that favored neither the Allies nor the Central Powers. In 1914, most Americans saw no reason to join a struggle 3,000 miles away. The war did not threaten American lives or property. This does not mean, however, that individual Americans were indifferent about the war. Public opinion was strong and divided. Socialists in the United States criticized the war as a capitalistic and economic struggle between Germany and England to control markets and colonies in China, Africa, and the Middle East. Pacifists, such as William Jennings Bryan, believed that the war was evil and that the U.S. should set an example of peace to the world. Many Americans simply did not want to send their sons to experience the horrors of war on a foreign continent. Millions of naturalized U.S. citizens followed the war closely because they still had ties to the nations from which they had immigrated. Many Americans, however, felt close to Britain because of a common ancestry and language, as well as similar democratic institutions and legal systems. Germany's aggressive sweep through Belgium increased American sympathy for the Allies. Yellow journalism again became popular, painting Germany as the bully of Europe. More importantly, America's economic ties with the Allies were far stronger than its ties with the Central Powers. Before the war, American trade with Britain and France was more than double American trade with Germany. The Allies flooded America with orders for all sorts of war supplies. In the first 2 years of the war, America's transatlantic trade became even more lopsided in favor of Britain and France, and by 1915, Allied demand created a labor shortage in the U.S. Although the majority of Americans favored victory for the Allies rather than for the Central Powers, they did not want to join the Allies' fight. The trouble for the U.S. arose from the efforts of belligerent powers to stop supplies from reaching the enemy. Having the stronger navy, Great Britain was the first to declare a naval blockade against Germany by mining the North Sea and seizing ships, including U.S. ships, attempting to run the blockade. The results of this British blockade were twofold. First, American ships carrying goods for Germany refused to challenge the blockade and seldom reached their destination. President Wilson protested British seizure of American ships as a violation of a neutral country's right to freedom of the seas. Second, Germany found it increasingly difficult to import food and fertilizers for its crops. By 1917, famine stalked the German countryside. An estimated 750,000 Germans starved to death as a direct result of the British naval blockade during the war. Americans were angered by Britain's blockade because it threatened freedom of the seas and prevented American goods from reaching German ports. However, Germany's response to this naval blockade soon outraged Americans even more. Not having a navy as powerful as that of Great Britain, Germany's only hope for challenging British power at sea lay with a new naval weapon, the Unterseeboot, or submarine, called a U-boat. In February 1915, Germany announced a blockade of its own and warned that ships attempting to enter the war zone, the waters around the British Isles, risked being sunk on sight and without warning by their U-boats. The first major crisis challenging U.S. neutrality and one of the worst disasters involving Germany's U-boat war occurred in May 1915. On May 7, 1915, the British passenger liner Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat off the southern coast of Ireland. Of the 1,128 persons lost, 128 were American citizens. The Germans defended their actions by claiming that the liner was carrying ammunition. Despite this explanation, Americans were enraged over the loss of American lives, and American public opinion turned firmly against Germany and the Central Powers. President Wilson protested German policy of sinking unarmed ships. Germany responded by pledging that no other unarmed passenger ships would be torpedoed without first allowing the passengers and crew to abandon the ship prior to the attack. Germany kept its word until March 1916, when a German torpedo struck an unarmed merchant ship, the Sussex, injuring several American passengers. Wilson threatened to cut off diplomatic relations with Germany, a step preparatory to war. Once again, rather than risk U.S. entry into the war on the side of the Allies, Germany backed down, but with the condition that if the U.S. could not persuade Britain to lift its blockade against food to Germany, Germany would renew unrestricted submarine warfare. For the remainder of 1916, Germany was true to its word. Wilson was well aware that, as a Democrat, he had won the election to presidency in 1912 only because of the split in the Republican Party between Taft conservatives and Roosevelt progressives. Despite his own progressive record, Wilson's chances for re-election seemed weak after Roosevelt rejoined the Republican Party in 1916. Roosevelt's decision to leave the progressives virtually destroyed the Progressive Party, but Roosevelt also refused to accept the Republican nomination, which instead went to Supreme Court Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes. Wilson campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The peace sentiment in the country, combined with Wilson's progressive record and Hughes' weakness as a candidate, gave the victory to Wilson in an extremely close election. After the election, Wilson tried to mediate between the warring European alliances, but every attempt to arrange peace failed. In a speech before the Senate in January 1917, Wilson called for a peace without victory, a peace between equals, in which neither side would impose harsh terms on the other, and all nations would work to extend democracy, maintain freedom of the seas, and reduce armaments. Germany ignored Wilson's calls for peace. German leaders realized that their only hope to defeat Britain was to revive unrestricted submarine warfare, but to do so would surely bring the U.S. into the war on the side of Britain. Germany decided to gamble, believing it could win the war by cutting off Allied supplies before the United States could mobilize and enter the conflict. On January 31, 1917, the German leader, Kaiser Wilhelm, announced that German U-boats would sink all ships in British waters, hostile or neutral, on sight. Wilson was stunned by the announcement. He knew now that the U.S. would have to go to war, but held back, saying that he would wait for actual overt acts of German aggression before declaring war. Wilson did not have to wait long. On March 1, 1917, U.S. newspapers carried the shocking news of a secret offer made by Germany to Mexico. Intercepted by British intelligence, a telegram to Mexico from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann proposed that Mexico ally itself with Germany in a war against the United States. In return for Mexican help, Germany would help Mexico recover the territories that it lost to the United States in the war between America and Mexico in 1846. In other words, if Mexico sided with Germany in war against the United States, Germany would make certain that the territories or states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona would be returned to Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram aroused the nationalist anger of the American people and convinced Wilson that Germany fully expected a war with the United States. Finally, however, it was events in Russia that removed the last obstacle to U.S. involvement in the war. In March 1917, the oppressive Russian monarchy was overthrown and replaced with a representative government. Later in November of 1917, this revolutionary government would actually be overthrown itself, and control of the country would be taken over by communists. Now, supporters of America's entry into the war could claim that this was a war of democracies against brutal, oppressive, and totalitarian governments. America could now enter the war on the principle of moral diplomacy. Towards the end of March, German U-boats sank 5 unarmed American merchant ships. And on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson addressed a large audience in the U.S. Capitol and made his resolution of war, claiming the world must be made safe for democracy. Congress passed the resolution 4 days later on April 6, 1917, with an overwhelming majority, although a few pacifists, including Robert La Follette and Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress, voted against the war. With the hope of neutrality finally shattered, American troops prepared for war. They would follow the stream of American money and American munitions that had already crossed the Atlantic to enter the fight. Wilson, as well as many other Americans, fully believed that America had to enter the war to pave the way for a future order of peace and freedom. Military operations from the United States during its year of warfare in the First World War saw the resumption of the Selective Service Act, which drafted over 3 million troops, the first time a draft had been enacted in the United States since the Civil War. American troops trained for 9 months, but then we had problems of transportation. The government controlled the industry, and they used a convoy system to ferry these troops to Europe in hopes of combating the U-boats that prowled the Atlantic between North America and Europe. One of the popular songs of the day, Over There, told the story of American troops going to fight in Europe. General John Blackjack Pershing was tapped to lead the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, to Europe, and in the fighting that followed, American heroes rose to the top. Sergeant Alvin York, who single-handedly captured hundreds of German troops in fighting, and Eddie Rickenbacker, who was a prominent American ace who shot down 26 German planes in combat. U.S. troops were involved in major fighting at Chateau Thierry, the Argonne, and Belleau Wood, and played a prominent role in turning the balance toward the side of the Allies until the armistice on November 11, 1918. Winning the war was not just a job for American soldiers alone. It was a conflict of smokestacks, driving wheels, and engines. Because the war was such an immense conflict, the entire national economy had to be focused on the war effort. Business and government collaborated in this front. Congress gave President Wilson direct control over much of the economy, including the power to fix prices and regulate, even nationalize, certain war-related industries. The War Industries Board became the main regulatory body established in 1917. It encouraged companies to use mass production techniques to increase efficiency and also urged them to eliminate waste by standardizing products. It set production quotas and allocated raw materials. Under the War Industries Board, industrial production increased 20%. Other regulatory agencies included the Railroad Administration, which controlled railroads, the Fuel Administration, which monitored coal supplies, rationed gasoline and heating oil, and the Fuel Administration also instituted daylight saving time in March 1918 as another fuel-saving conservation measure. This allows us to take advantage of longer days of summer, first proposed by Benjamin Franklin in 1770. Wages rose in most industries as the war economy took effect, but were largely undercut by rising prices. Stockholders continued to see tremendous profits, and union membership increased dramatically. To deal with disputes between management and labor, Wilson established the National War Labor Board in 1918, which worked on the premise of work or fight. Workers who refused to obey the board lost their draft exemption and were drafted into the Army. The Food Administration actually helped produce and conserve food. The gospel of the clean plate encouraged rationing, declared certain days of the week meatless Mondays, sweetless days, wheatless days, porkless days. Homeowners planted victory gardens, and school children grew tomatoes to help with the war effort. As a result of these efforts, American food shipments to the Allies tripled. America spent about $35.5 billion on the war effort. 1/3 of this was raised through taxes, including a progressive income tax, a war profits tax, a higher excise tax on liquor, tobacco, and luxury goods. The rest of the money was raised through public borrowing by selling Liberty Loan and Victory Loan bonds. To popularize the war, the government set up the nation's first propaganda agency, the Committee on Public Information, or CPI. This agency persuaded the nation's artists and advertising agencies to create thousands of paintings, posters, cartoons, and other forms of art promoting the war. The propaganda campaign was highly effective and promoted patriotism. It also inflamed hatred and violation of the civil liberties of certain ethnic groups and opponents of the war. Attacks on civil liberties prompted by war hysteria began almost as soon as the U.S. declared war in 1917. The main targets of these attacks were Americans who had immigrated from other nations, especially those from Germany and Austria-Hungary. The most bitter attacks were aimed at the more than 2 million Americans who had been born in Germany. Americans with German names lost their jobs. Orchestras refused to play music by German composers. Schools stopped teaching the German language. Librarians removed books by German authors from the shelves, and the names of German products were changed. Germans were also the victims of countless acts of violence. In June 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act and was followed in May of 1918 by the Sedition Act. Under these acts, a person could be fined up to $10,000 and sentenced to 20 years in jail for interfering with the war effort or for saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government or the war effort. Like the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, these laws clearly violated the spirit of the First Amendment. Their passage led to over 2,000 prosecutions for loosely defined anti-war activities, and over half resulted in convictions. The Espionage and Sedition Acts targeted socialist and labor leaders. Eugene Debs was handed a 10-year prison sentence for speaking out against the war and the draft. Big Bill Haywood and other leaders of the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, were accused of sabotaging the war effort by urging workers to strike for better conditions and higher pay during wartime. Haywood was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The IWW faded away under intense federal pressure. The greatest effect of World War I on the lives of African Americans was that it accelerated what was known as the Great Migration, the large-scale movement of hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks to cities in the North. This population shift had begun before the war when African Americans began to trickle northward in an attempt to escape the Jim Crow South. During World War I, this trickle became a tidal wave. Several factors contributed to this increase in the Great Migration. African Americans sought to escape racial discrimination in the South. Boll weevil infestation and other natural disasters ruined much of the South's cotton fields. More job opportunities in the North, the outbreak of the war, the draft, and a decrease in European immigration also increased job opportunities for African Americans in the steel mills, munitions plants, and stockyards. However, racial prejudice also existed in the North. The Great Migration increased overcrowding and intensified racial tensions in the cities. An increased role of women led to passage and ratification, finally, of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. Even before the war was over, President Wilson prepared his plan for world peace. He delivered his famous 14-point speech to Congress on January 18, 1918. The points were divided into 3 groups. The first 5 were issues that Wilson believed had to be addressed to prevent another war. There should be no secret treaties or alliances. The freedom of the seas should be maintained for all. Tariffs and other economic barriers should be lowered or abolished to foster free trade. Arms should be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, lessening the possibility that they would be used during diplomatic crises. Colonial policy should consider the interest of the colonial people as well as the interest of the imperialist powers. The next 8 points dealt with boundary issues. These provisions were based on the principle of self-determination. The 14th point called for the creation of an international organization to address diplomatic crises like those that had sparked the war. This League of Nations would provide a forum for nations to discuss and settle their grievances peacefully without having to resort to war. Wilson failed to grasp the anger of the Allied leaders. Clemenceau from France had lived through 2 German invasions of his country. Lloyd George from Britain had just won re-election on the slogan, "Make Germany Pay," and Orlando from Italy wanted to control the Austrian-held territory. The peace conference did not include the defeated Central Powers, nor did it include Russia, whose government by this time was under the control of communists. Instead, the Big Four, Wilson, Clemenceau, Lord George, and Orlando, worked out the treaty's details among themselves. Wilson conceded on most of his 14 points in return for the establishment of a League of Nations. On June 28, 1919, the Big Four and leaders of the defeated nations gathered in the Palace of Versailles near Paris to sign the peace treaty. The provisions of the Treaty of Versailles were as follows. It established 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and shifted the boundaries of other nations. It carved 5 areas out of the Ottoman Empire and gave them to France and Britain as mandates or temporary colonies. It barred Germany from maintaining an army. It required Germany to return the region of Alsace-Lorraine to France, and it required Germany to pay war reparations to the Allies amounting to $33 billion. Treatment of Germany weakened the ability of the treaty to provide a lasting peace. Several basic flaws in the Treaty of Versailles would sow the seeds of the Second World War. The treaty humiliated Germany. It contained a war guilt clause forcing Germany to admit sole responsibility for starting World War I. And there was no way that Germany, who was in economic shambles at the end of the war, could repay the huge financial reparations of $33 billion. Germany was stripped of its colonial possessions in the Pacific, which might have helped it repay some of those reparation bills. Russia had fought on the side of the Allies for 3 years, sustaining more casualties during the war than any other nation. But Russia was excluded from the peace conference and treaty. It lost more territory than did Germany, and the new Soviet Union was determined to regain its lost territory. The treaty also ignored the claims of colonized people for self-determination. President Wilson returned home from this conference to find opposition to the treaty in the U.S. as well, on the basis of the harsh economic conditions, new national boundaries, and other concerns. The main point of domestic opposition centered on the issue of the League of Nations. Many believed that it threatened the U.S. foreign policy of isolationism. Wilson refused to compromise and set out on an 8,000-mile tour to promote the League despite his own ill health. On October 2, 1919, while on this tour, Wilson suffered a stroke and was unable to continue. He could hardly speak, much less promote the League. The Senate eventually voted to reject American involvement in the League of Nations in 2 separate votes. We eventually signed a separate peace treaty with Germany in 1921 after Wilson was no longer president. The United States never joined the League of Nations. After the war, many Americans looked forward to a return to normalcy, but World War I had strengthened the U.S. government and the U.S. military. It had changed the country forever. In Europe, the destruction and massive loss of life severely damaged social and political systems. The war created political instability and violence that were persist for decades. During the war years, the first communist state was established in Russia. After the war, militant fascist organizations seized power in Italy, Spain, and eventually in Germany. America began to call World War I the war to end all wars, in the hope that humanity would never again be willing to fight such a war. However, unresolved issues in Europe would eventually drag America into another, more costly conflict. The Treaty of Versailles had settled nothing. In fact, some Europeans longed to resume the fight. 2 decades after the end of the Great War, Adolf Hitler's desire for vengeance would plunge the world into an even greater war.